Good morning, everyone, in U.S. History 2, final chapter, Chapter 30, Recent History. Um, sometimes I'm not a big fan of historical contextual discussions that are really just in the rearview mirror of very recent history, because sometimes I think it's almost like a wine. It needs time to breathe before we evaluate what the different outcomes were of different events that transpired. Um, just in our own time or a very recent past. But nonetheless, I think Chapter 30 does a pretty good job of trying to tackle that. It ends with the Reagan administration coming to a close. He serves 2 terms, and we know as a result of the constitutional amendment back in the 1950s, presidents are relegated to 2 elected terms. And so now the new election's coming up. Conservatism is still pretty popular. There is a growing movement on the right of religious participation in the political sphere. But there's just a general view of popular conservatism that survives Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan brought it into vogue. He was very, very popular in his own time, and he was even more popular after the end of his presidency. And therefore, I think the candidate for the Republican Party, George Bush, Ronald Reagan's vice president for 2 terms, definitely had a leg up, and the mood was still for that, not radical conservatism, but modestly conservative viewpoint was really hitting the breadbasket of the American ideology, and he had a very, very good chance of winning election. His opponent, our own Michael Dukakis from Massachusetts, very popular at the time in Massachusetts. He had served non-consecutive times as governor of Massachusetts. Sometimes they called it the Massachusetts Miracle. Unfortunately, by the time he was running for president, much of the Massachusetts Miracle had evaporated, and we were hit with an economic downturn. But what's interesting about the election was, although he himself, I don't think, held that ideology, George Bush cast a clear delineation between Mike Dukakis, the Massachusetts liberal elitist, even though George Bush came from a very New England family out of Connecticut. He was a son of a senator and very highly educated at Yale College. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. But he was able to cast Dukakis as a very, very liberal, almost radical liberal, and he also used some race baiting. I don't know if it was initially him or Lee Atwater, his campaign coordinator, brought out these videos of a guy by the name of Willie Horton who was serving a lengthy jail sentence but got parole and went out and committed either another murder or rape. I forgot, very serious. But it was showing images of Willie Horton and other basically people of color going through the revolving door of justice. And George Bush, being a conservative law and order person, shouldn't and wouldn't allow that kind of political philosophy to take over the White House, and therefore George Bush should be supported. That was some of the underlying currents in the election. George Bush was a moderate, there's no question about it. Mike Dukakis probably more moderate than he was labeled as, but nonetheless, the election came down to a landslide victory in the Electoral College and in the popular vote for George Bush. He wins in a landslide. I believe it was 420 to like 111 Electoral College vote. Dukakis does win a few states. He wins Massachusetts, he wins New York. I think he wins a couple of central upper Midwest states like Illinois, maybe Indiana, Wisconsin. I think he wins. I know he wins Oregon and Washington. Maybe say, what are you, Rick Rain Man or something, Jim? Well, I kind of am when it comes to politics. I really get into it, and that was the age. I was in college. I was probably a student. Well, this is the election video. I was actually starting law school. I was always fascinated with politics, so this is my fresh memory. Dukakis loses. He runs a very poor campaign relative to George Bush, and so George Bush wins a landslide. And George Bush, during his time, what great historical events happened for U.S. history during that period? We know the first Iraq War. Iraq becomes very, very aggressive. They were many years at war with Iran, and we supported Iraq during that period of time. But now Iraq is having tensions with a very small but very oil-rich country called Kuwait. They invade. George Bush says we have to take action, and so Congress agrees. And they don't declare war, but they authorize basically military intervention. And we have a very, very rapid, quick war. Back then, I remember there was like a lot of attention to people like his name's not Arnold Schwarzenegger, but his name is Schwarzkopf. General Schwarzkopf is the command leader of the military forces, and they really eviscerate the Iraqi military quite quickly. But George Bush, being the moderate that he really was, decided not to go into Iraq. He said, we beat him, we got him out of Kuwait. That was our goal. We're not into nation building. We're not going to do regime change. We're not going to do that. And as a result of that, there were some arguments that that's why we needed the second Iraq War that comes about when George Herbert Walker Bush, the younger George Bush's son, becomes the president because Iraq supposedly has weapons of mass destruction. But anyways, during his period of time, George Bush, first time he's in office, first election, things are going pretty good. The economy initially is doing pretty well. We enter into this conflict in Iraq. It goes extremely well. We get him out of Kuwait. There's sort of a sense of national pride that our military is, omnipotent, and we're able to do that. And Bush, in a book, does a nice job saying Bush won enormous popular support. Gallup polls show job approval ratings as high as 89% at the end of the first Gulf War. It really is incredible how highly regarded he was at this stage in his presidency. Well, of course, he's going to run for re-election, and he's a little bit tone deaf about the AIDS crisis. He's a little tone deaf about gay and lesbian equity and equality in the United States. But he's not a knee-jerk, rabid conservative by any means. And he's up against Bill Clinton, the New Democrats. That's what they call themselves. Bill Clinton and his running mate Al Gore are actually very conservative Democrats, and they believe in things like welfare reform. In fact, they actually pass, once they get in, they pass a criminal justice reform bill that's actually fairly draconian and is very, very conservative in nature. It actually locked up a lot of people. Mass incarcerations happen as a result of that. But in the election, Clinton is dynamic. He's very, very engaging. He goes on the shows like, would be like today, going on like one of the night, well, actually it wouldn't be like today because cable television changed things, but back in that era there was a few cable night television shows. One of them was Arsenio Hall, and he came out and played the saxophone. He's young, he's engaging. Whether you like him or not, that's what the American population saw. George Bush runs on his record. I thought George Bush, personally, when I was watching this campaign, was going to win in a landslide. But what happens as we get closer to the election? There's a surprise, really a shocking recession. And Bill Clinton was able to convince voters, and this is in the book, that is moderate Southern brand of liberalism. Basically, he's just as middle of the road as George Bush is, but he has a more effective plan, and he's going to be able to cure the economic recession that George Bush isn't addressing. And George Bush loses some of the conservative underpinnings of his campaign because he has an opponent in the primary, a guy by the name of Pat Buchanan. He's part of this early Tea Party concept of very, very, very conservative, anti-tax, small government ideology, this libertarian view. And I don't think it necessarily undid George Bush, but it was chipping away at his support within his own base. So that, coupled with a rapid recession, and one of the more famous things, I don't know how much, you can get into the whole psychology of why people vote the way they do, but one of the things all along the election pathway was George Bush saying, I won't read taxes. And his famous quote was, read my lips and I won't raise taxes. And what did he do? Raise taxes. Be careful what you promise. And boy, even though Clinton was going to probably raise taxes anyways, but they beat him to death over that. And it was a very close election, but we know George Bush, the elder, lost that election, and Bill Clinton goes on to serve 2 terms. There is a conservative backlash as a result of Clinton being elected. There was a lot of immigration issues that started to really come to a point because people come to this country, and we know that's a problem to this day. We have issues about what do we do about both legal and illegal immigration. How much should we have? What should we do? What should we do with people who are illegal that are in the country? Should we have some kind of grace period if they've been here for a long time and haven't committed any other illegal act besides the illegality of coming to the country illegally? All these issues were really coming to a simmer during Clinton's and George Bush, the elder's presidency. And you have to do some analysis. Why is this happening? Well, it's because their own countries are rife with crime, recession, poor educational system, poor healthcare. And think about it, if you have kids and family, or you yourself are struggling because your country is flailing, wouldn't you be compelled maybe to try to enter in another country where you can do better for your family? And Clinton had a hard time with trying to address it, and it was considered to be part of both in George Bush the senior and George Bush the younger and Bill Clinton, they never came to any real um, solution on immigration and how to curtail it and how to fix it and how to do we build a wall? Do we do these things? We know Trump believes building a wall would be part of the process. Other people think you have to deal with the countries that are struggling so much to make people have an incentive to stay at home. There's so many issues with that. But part of the backlash during this period of time from conservatives was things that Bill Clinton put in, which I kind of laughed at today. Like one was the don't ask, don't tell. He says, I'm progressive, but I'm not that progressive. He didn't believe in initially that gays and lesbians should have the right to marry, and he didn't think gays and lesbians should be openly allowed to be in the military. But he was more liberal than the conservative Republican Party on this, and he created something which I think is kind of a mockery in hindsight. Don't ask, don't tell. That means if you're a gay or lesbian, you could serve in the military, but the recruiters and basically the personnel, the HR department of the military couldn't ask if you were a gay or lesbian, and you couldn't tell because if you did, the military still had a power to throw you out. That looks very, I don't know, naive in hindsight. And one thing the book doesn't get into, Clinton also passed something called DOMA because as gays and lesbians start getting the right to marry in some states, Massachusetts being one of the first, other states found it very resentful and said, we don't want to do that. And so should the state of like Alabama or Mississippi have to recognize a gay or lesbian marriage that was entered into in the state of Massachusetts? So Bill Clinton and the Congress passed something called DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, which allowed states, I don't know how it couldn't be unconstitutional because it's basically violating the full faith and credit clause. Basically, the Supreme Court agreed with me later on in overturning DOMA as an unconstitutional law. It was unenforced during Obama's years anyways, but the Supreme Court ultimately does DOMA. But DOMA was a real slap in the face to a lot of gays and lesbians that were gaining marital rights in some states, but then they would go back to their home states or want to move or immigrate to a different state in the union, and their marriage might not be validly recognized. It created real tension in our country, and we know eventually the Supreme Court in a case called Hodges basically said gays and lesbians have a fundamental right because they're a class of people, and all classes of people have the same fundamental rights as all other classes. That this is during the Obama administration that the Supreme Court ultimately shut it down. But a lot of people think of the Clintons as very, maybe Hillary is very liberal, but Bill Clinton was very cautious and fairly conservative on a lot of these social policies, especially criminal justice reform was very conservative under Bill Clinton. A lot of people got locked up. I think some laws were very draconian, actually, during Clinton's administration. But we know part of the backlash was the Contract of America. Congress turns to conservatism, turns to republicanism, and there's a lot of tension between Bill Clinton, who's a moderate, but he's still a Democrat. He's still considered to be liberal by the standards of Newt Gingrich and Dick Armey, who created this thing called the Contract of America, saying we're going to uphold conservative values, low taxation, small government, all these things that were popular, and they created something called Contract of America, and they basically take over both the Senate and the House. And as a result of that, the conservative political structure is able to block a lot of things that Clinton might want to push through. And we know there's loggerhead. In fact, there was a period of time that over the budget, the Congress refused to act and the government shut down for a period of time. I think the conservatives took a hit on that. They got blamed for a lot of the loggerhead or the stalemate, if you will, between the executive and the Congress. Bill Clinton was able to masterfully make it look like it was the Congress's fault during this period of time. But Clinton did a lot of conservative things during this period of time. One was welfare reform. Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996 decreased welfare benefits. It restricted eligibility in a big way. It turned over many responsibilities to the state. The federal government was going to get out of the welfare system, do these things called block grants, give them to the states, and they determine eligibility for welfare. That's why if you go to different parts of the country right now, there are different, more lucrative and less lucrative, if you will, safety nets in the welfare system depending on the state guidelines that they created. The economy does boom during the Clinton administration, largely because the internet and technology really changed. We think about cell phones. I can remember getting my first flip phone, and that was before. Now I do work on my phone, computer. I do research on my phone, and we know technology really changed a lot. Unfortunately, Al Gore during this period of time, he's going to run for president. I don't know why he said it. He never really clarified why he said it. At least I never heard him clarify. He said during a debate that he had invented the internet. I don't know if it was any one person, but it certainly wasn't Al Gore. We know the tension between Bill Clinton and the Republican Party gets so acrimonious that he actually is impeached. And I know he's impeached for perjury. And he was convicted of perjury. There's no question. I shouldn't say he was convicted of perjury. He admitted perjury. He lied. A lot of people think he got impeached because he had an affair with an intern, Monica Lewinsky. That was troubling enough. But what he did was he lied in testimony over a sexual harassment lawsuit by a woman named Jones. And in that, he lied about having a relationship with this intern, and that lie is perjury. He actually got disbarred for a period of time. I don't know if he still is in the state of Arkansas where he's from. But the Congress, he's the second president to have been impeached, which is just simply a majority of the House of Representatives saying he committed high crimes and misdemeanors, whatever the hell that means. And we know it went to the Senate, and the Senate requires 2/3. And on a party line, there was no way they were going to get 2/3 of vote. He was acquitted. Most Americans saw the impeachment of Clinton as being politically motivated. There's no question in history that it was. In fact, he becomes just as popular after the acquittal with many people, not with all. I'm not getting into my views too much, but he does stay very, very popular as a result of that. Clinton's out. He, in history, other than the Monica Lewinsky affair, and kind of getting a reputation of being maybe not the most integrity-filled individual, does have a successful 2 terms of president for the most part in terms of his battles with the conservative Congress. He's viewed in history, I think, fairly popularly for the most part. His wife, not so much, and that's one of the reasons we'll get to in a second. I'm going a lot longer in this video than I thought I would. We know Al Gore, who's wanted to distance himself from Clinton because Clinton's last term closes with this acrimony over the impeachment and over his integrity and his lying about whether he had an affair, then trying to tell the truth, and he brings in a bunch of religious people. It looked really, really trouble. So instead of Al Gore, adopting on part of the Clinton era, he tries to distance himself from that, and he runs against George Bush the younger, President Bush's. I don't know if it's his oldest son, but his son, a former governor of Texas, and a religious evangelical himself. And don't forget, the conservative movement has a lot of support from evangelicals in the religious movement. And the race is on. Al Gore actually wins the popular vote. There's no question about it. But he loses the Electoral College in a very narrow election. And it was really, I thought, terrible, because I remember talking to my friends that night where initially Al Gore concedes and says, then he changes his mind. If you're going to concede, you better know you're going to concede. And then they have a recount down in Florida, and there was these voting machines that had these things called chads. It's like you punch out like the little hole, and the little tab's supposed to fall off, but sometimes they wouldn't fall off, and they would keep like a little lip, almost like a hinge. And then there's a question about, is that a valid vote or not? And then the state of Florida finally determines that there's a lead for Bush in the end. But the recount keeps going. It goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court rules that the recount has to end now. It's over as the last certified election based upon the Secretary of State of that state of Florida, who was a very conservative supporter of George Bush. Not that that has anything to do with it, in my opinion. But nonetheless, it kind of makes it smell a little bit. So some people say the Supreme Court declares George Bush the winner. I don't see it that way. It was Al Gore that brought it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was just simply to determine whether or not the Florida recount and process followed the law, and it determined that it did, and therefore George Bush was the president. And Al Gore, although won the popular vote, he did not want to do away with the Electoral College, which if he did, we know Hillary Clinton would have beaten Donald Trump, and we know that Al Gore would have beaten George Bush in the first election. Well, we know we've got, so Bush is in office, and we have probably one of the most monumental events in our history. We've been in many wars. We've had many conflicts. Many of our servicemen and women and civilians have died in war, but rarely in the continental United States. Although the Civil War was massive, but we're fighting against ourselves, right? And same with the Revolutionary War. But I'm talking about, I guess, a real foreign entity. Not in any recent history. We always felt somewhat protected by the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean. And then we have the events of 9/11. I still remember it very, very well. I remember it was in Worcester District Court. I remember I was getting a date, and I'm getting out of court really quick. And I was usually good at that. And when it was just a date and I'm doing anything meaningful. And I remember I was in Worcester District Court in the old courthouse, and I drove down to Auburn, Mass. And I'm a coffee junkie, in case you didn't know. Stopped at Dunkin' Donuts in Auburn, and there was people watching TV. Like a TV monitor, and there's a one of the towers was smoking, and people were kind of gathering on the TV, maybe 4 or 5 people. And I'm not the most social person, but I kind of look, and I said, "Oh, is this about the sentencing?" Don't you got to remember, the World Trade Center was attacked by Al Qaeda, this work of religious fundamentalist Islamic terrorists who were against Western interests and felt that there was an exploitive thing from Western imperialism. And in 1993, they had, I think it's 93, don't quote me on that one, but they had attacked the World Trade Center and put a bomb in the basement. A few people got killed, but it wasn't anything like bringing the buildings down. And the sentencing was coming up for one of the attackers from the early 1990s attack on the World Trade Center. And the guy just says to me, he goes, no, it's not about the sentencing. A plane just crashed into it. And as I'm watching, I watched the second plane go into the second tower. And I said, how is that? Like I was bewildered by it. Is that like a replay? But it's already smoking. How is it a replay? And then this woman was there and goes, I think another plane just hit it. I'm like, what the hell? I didn't even think of a terrorist attack. It was just bizarre seeing planes crashing into the World Trade Center. All the news shows are, we don't know what's going on. And I remember all that day being very agitated. I went home instead of going back to the law office, and there was news stories of explosions going on in the building, whether they were planted bombs. That all seemed to disappear. There's a lot of theories, conspiracy theories, but we know what really happened was it was a group of Qaeda that out of mostly Afghanistan, but it's supported by certain Saudi Arabian ex, expatriates. One of them being Osama bin Laden, had planned and did this and there was another plane brought down in Pennsylvania because the people on the plane became aware of all these hijacked planes, and they knew they were hijacked, and they rushed the cockpit, ended up making a crash in a field, and everybody perished. Another one of the planes that was successful, I should say successfully, it's not sterile, but that was hijacked, we know crashed into the Pentagon, and many people died there as well. But boy, 9/11 shook us to the core. We changed our entire outlook in terms of security in many ways. It changed the way we interpret unreasonable searches and seizures under the Fourth Amendment. We changed our values on civil liberties because there was a growing concern about safety over freedom. There's no question about it. Changed that kind of shift. I thought in this era, George W. Bush, in terms of going down to New York City and saying that those who were responsible were going to pay for this, I thought he did a fairly decent job of rallying the country's sort of moral backbone over it. And I'll be honest, I'm not a huge fan of George Bush. The President Bush, I thought, did a decent job of giving the country a sort of sense of unity and direction. And I think it was just a few nights later, it was a World Series game, he threw out the first pitch without fear of, everyone was like on pins. When's the next attack? I remember one of my friends worked in the juvenile court a lot, and they were putting up these barricades out of it the weeks after 9/11. And, and he said, what's going on? He goes, we have to close the court until the barricades are up because of the traffic and everything. Or have to close early or something like that. And my friend said to the judge, he goes, yeah, he goes, that's the one thing they're going to target is all these delinquent juveniles. They would be doing us a favor instead of, why would they want to go after that? And the judge got really upset with him, saying, we could be a target. But I don't know. We know and since then we've always considered any big events to be potentially not just targets of our enemies, but also targets of domestic terrorists. And we do have some domestic terrorists. People sometimes don't like to talk about it, but we do have people that will go out and do mass shootings and things. We had Timothy McVeigh that was very upset over the Waco events, where the federal government went into a Waco religious compound to, I guess, seize weapons, and things went very much awry, and many people died. And Timothy McVeigh thought that was an outrage what the federal government did, and therefore he blew up a federal building, and many people died in that. That was a domestic terrorist. A United States citizen did it. But anyways, we've lived in a very different time after 9/11. We know as a result of that, we went into Afghanistan. Initially, things I think went pretty well. The Taliban military wasn't very powerful, but we got kind of sucked in. We're still there to this day, although the newest president we have, Joe Biden, is going to withdraw troops. He says, ironically, I don't know if it's ironic, but as maybe it's a never-ending war, and it probably would be a never-ending war, and it's time for U.S. forces to get out. And I think he's calling them back on September 11th of 2000. 21, and that'll mark 20-year war, very, very significant. But we know after that, George Bush in his second term, his opponent in the interim election is John Kerry, another extremely close election. But there's John Kerry, another Massachusetts person, Vietnam veteran though, 2 Purple Heart winners, but they made it sound as though those Purple Hearts weren't necessarily that significant. And of course, he did speak out against the Vietnam War, and they used it as another label of this liberal, Massachusetts Democrat, Harvard educated, is going to take us down the wrong path, especially since we have now this new war on terror. The problem with the war on terror is not against a specific country. I mean, we went into Afghanistan, but it's more about an ideology, and it's fought all over the world. That makes it very, very, very challenging to try to figure out what the heck it is that we're fighting for and where. And it's this never-ending amorphous sort of opponent. And that created what's known as the Bush Doctrine. And the Bush Doctrine basically said, and I think it's one of the part of your mini test questions, is that basically we will go unilaterally anywhere in the world to protect American for potential threats. We'll make war on any regime, any terrorist organization that poses any threat to the United States or its citizens. I don't know if that's really a new doctrine, but that's what Bush was labeled as, having this thing called the Bush Doctrine. Over 3,000 people got killed in just a very short period of time in New York. I didn't know anybody directly, but I knew some people indirectly that had lost a family or friends in that event, and it still kind of shakes us to the core. Then the end. John Kerry loses in a very, very close thing. We know some dark things come out of this. Then we have a second war in Iraq, because there's fear. A lot of people think Iraq had something to do with 9/11. Nothing at all to do with it. But there's growing tensions with the Iraq regime under Saddam Hussein. There's a fear that they have weapons of mass destruction. They want to retaliate against us from that previous war we had over Kuwait. And there's really a push for war. And I remember saying there's plenty of evidence, but no one ever seemed to show any evidence. But the American people sort of bought it. And the great quote from, I believe it was George Bush: "Facing clear evidence of peril, although the evidence was never shown, we know, trust us, we cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun that would come in the form of a mushroom cloud, whether he had weapons of mass destruction that were nuclear, or whether they were dirty bombs or chemical weapon, we didn't know, but there was a belief, and he sold it to the American people, and he got authorization from Congress. One of the people that opposed it was then, I believe, a state senator, but he might have been a U.S. senator from Illinois, and that's Barack Obama, opposed the war, going in a second time to Iraq. And we go in, we clean house fairly easily initially, but then it's an occupation force. And George Bush said he never wanted to be in a situation of nation building, but now we are. And Iraq had a lot of internal tensions between different Muslim groups that were often at war with one another. The Kurds in the northern region was a completely almost different religious faith. Then there's the Sunni and the Shiite Muslims, 2 different Muslim groups that are often at tension. And we become this occupying force, and it really, I think, ended in a nightmare. And what did we never find? We never found any weapons of mass destruction. Ultimately, combat forces withdraw from Iraq cities in June 30th of 2009, and the last combat forces left Iraq in December 2011. We entered there in 2002. We're there for over nearly 10 years, and the country's left in disarray, and it's still very unstable at this point right now. We know some things happened during this period of time that put a black eye in American policy over there. It had nothing to do with George Bush, but we had an Abu Ghraib prison where prisoners were humiliated. There was photographs taken of them nude, and they were, well, I guess some might say tortured. I think it was more a process of humiliation and degradation, and that gave us a black eye throughout the entire world in terms of what is our mission in Iraq, and what are we doing there. The next big thing that I think was troublesome for George Bush was Katrina. Katrina wasn't his fault. A lot of people blame, but the aftermath of Katrina was this unbelievable storm. and the hurricane Category 5 broke the levees down there in Louisiana. A lot of people died, but the reaction, the response of the federal government looked a bit inept, and those that were ahead of things like um, the catastrophe department. I don't even know what you call it. One, basically a breeder of horses, a friend of the Bush family, totally incompetent, a guy named Brownie. Um, and there were others, and the reaction was considered to be slow and inappropriate. And George Bush was finally given enough prodding to go down in a helicopter to examine the events of that. Um, I think he takes a very hard hit for his reaction to Katrina. His reaction should have been done, but sometimes I think it's more symbolic. I mean, he didn't cause Katrina, and some of it's just the failing of the federal government as a whole. It's a very difficult, cumbersome set of machinery, and government doesn't always get things right. But George Bush took a very negative hit for his reaction and the federal government's reaction to the catastrophe of Katrina. It says Katrina became a symbol of a broken administrative system, a devastated coastline, irreparable social structures that allowed the escape and recovery for the rich, but for the poor, suffered and languished. And there wasn't much to be done. And then we know after George Bush, the Great Recession, right at the end of the Bush administration, banks were pretty much deregulated. They're lending money, especially in the mortgage departments, a bit improvidently, but they've always had the ability to foreclose, and because real estate always grows, they don't lose any money, and that creates stability. But finally, there's the real estate bubble, and then the mortgages collapse. Many banks go under, and it creates a huge recession. And it happened at the tail end of Bush, and the next president, of course, is Obama, first African American president in history. I remember watching his swearing in ceremony live. I was glued to the TV because I think it was a huge, epic period in history, because we do have a lot of racial strife and tension and misgivings about our ability to feel sort of oneness sometimes. And I thought that went a long way to sort of heal or bridge that problem. I don't know if it did in the long run, but in the short term, I think there was a lot of sense of this is a very special moment in American history in terms of whether political philosophy is very different, but I'm talking about in terms of an African American winning the White House. Of course, everything comes to stalemate when Obama comes into the presidency, except for one major piece of legislation, and that's because the Tea Party, which is not just one group of people, it's a very conservative movement, a lot of religious conservatives in it, a lot of libertarian values, meaning small government stay out of the way, and that stymied a lot of the goals of Obama. And Obama was actually a very cautious, I think almost conservative politician, because he recognized that he had a very narrow window of opportunity to get anything done. But his major piece of legislation accomplishment, sometimes called Obamacare, is the Affordable Care Act. What Hillary Clinton couldn't get done during Clinton's administration, Obama finally got passed very narrowly. It was very unpopular with many people. Other people were very excited about it. And we know his first or second campaign is going to go against Mitt Romney, and Mitt Romney kept attacking Obama for Obamacare, but Obamacare is basically modeled on Mitt Romney's plan that he had here in Massachusetts. So, and that's what the stagnation occurred. And even it says right here, Obama was a lame duck even before he won re-election. The gridlock of government came to represent an acute sense that much of American life, whether in politics, economic, or race relations, had become stagnant. And I think that sums it up very, very well. Got very, very little done during this period of time, not because of him, but because we became a very polarized people in the United States. And I don't think he caused it. I just think it was revealed during this period of time. And this is a shocking thing about stagnation when it comes to the economy. By 2016, the statistically average American worker had not received a raise in 40 years. I know there were raises, but what we mean about statistically meaningful was, with inflation and the cost of living and all those things, we haven't really grown as a society for the average American. Really amazing. We know in politics, there's a sense that political office is bought for. Look what it cost to run for president. And George Bush raised a record $172 million in 2000. Barack Obama raised $750 million for his campaign. The average House seat cost $1.6 million to run for. That's be a congressperson. The average Senate seat, also the other branch of Congress, the Senate, $10 million to run a meaningful campaign. And so where does this money come from? It comes from rich people. It comes from businesses. It comes from unions. And many people thought, it's the country's owned by the wealthy. And so John McCain and Russ Feingold, one's a Republican, one's a Democrat. Some people can argue that McCain's not a real Republican, but nonetheless, they came out with the McCain-Feingold Act and basically put restrictions on how much corporations can dump into political campaigns. And that was ruled unconstitutional during Barack Obama's administration. Went to the Supreme Court, and Citizens United, they wanted to put a video up about Hillary Clinton and dump a lot of money in a campaign against Hillary Clinton. It was deemed unconstitutional because corporations and unions and political PACs are entities that have freedom of speech rights. And when you curtail what they can spend money on, you're curtailing their First Amendment freedom of speech rights. Very controversial decision. And there's an amendment floating around right now to amend our United States Constitution to create some kind of check on the way in which corporations or businesses or unions or it doesn't have to be liberal or conservative, how much they can potentially contribute to political campaigns. There's already limits on what they can contribute to an individual candidate. But in terms of political advertising, in terms of causes of action, which basically, in a sense, still supports certain candidacies, that's unlimited. Shocks a lot of people. And then we know we've got the great Trump Hillary Clinton election. I thought in the beginning that Clinton was going to run away with it. She turned out to be a very unpopular candidate with many American people. So did Trump. There are the two most unpopular candidates of the Republican and Democratic Party in American history. And in a very narrow election, Hillary Clinton did win the popular vote. And then you guys can debate with me all day long. These are facts. She wins the popular vote. And you can say there's a lot of voter fraud, but until you prove it to me, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She did not win the election. There's no question in my mind that Donald Trump did win the Electoral College vote. He becomes the president. Some people say he's a very polarizing character. There's no question we become very polarized. I don't know if it's all because of him, but his presidency was a time where the nation really becomes divided, really almost violently so. And how do we know violently so? Because in really recent history, when we know Donald Trump serves his 4 years, he manages to get a tax cut through. The economy does boom during his period of time. Some people say you can't just complain about the guy if you don't like him. The reality is the economy did do very well, and he does withdraw from some military conflicts throughout the world. He keeps America. I mean, we didn't really have any major events during his period of time in terms of involvement of our military in foreign affairs, and the economy does boom. So, but a couple of things derail, I think, his mark on history is one is he becomes thought of as a guy that just says what he wants, whether it's based upon truth, facts, fiction, or fantasy. And the other is that during his period of time, the nation definitely becomes very, very split, very hostile groups, liberal, conservative. And I don't think Trump as liberal or conservative. Trump is a very unique individual. But the nation does become very, very divided during the course of his presidency. We know also during his period of time, that he loses the next election. He loses it to Joe Biden in a fairly close election, but there's controversy because some of the states are pretty close and they turn on the Electoral College, and Trump and many of his supporters alleged all kinds of voter fraud, but no evidence of it was done. Yet they say there's overwhelming evidence, and every time they went to court, they could produce none. I'm sure there's some voter fraud, but it's about enough to tip the balance in terms of changing the outcome. And none of that was able to be materialized. So, but people that supported Trump, the real rabid Republican, and not necessarily Republican, supporters of Trump, on the day that the Electoral College cast their votes, it's really a ceremonial process in the Congress, but it still has to be done. We know there was basically an insurrection. And for a period of time, our United States Capitol was overtaken by, for lack of a better way to say, hooligans. Really quite a scary period of time. And that's real recent history. And where will it go in the future? We know certain other things happened during this period. I already talked about Obergefell, which is versus Hodges. We talked about how that basically opened up gay marriage to lesbians and homosexual groups throughout the country. And one of the important statistics about the nature of our changing demographics in society, in 2012 is a while ago, but still in 2012, nearly 1/4 of all Americans were either immigrants themselves or children of immigrants. Really, really quite a remarkable change in the dynamics, mostly from Central America. Hey, I'm not a big fan of recent history, but we had to go over it a little bit. Hey, be well. That's the last chapter. Don't be afraid to reach out, and hopefully I'll see you in another class. This online stuff's a little bit challenging to make connections. I get that, but I hope you persevere and have the grit to stay through the semester and you learn something. And don't be afraid to read outside the class. Don't be afraid to read good articles from scholarly resources. Read good newspapers. Learn about what's going on in your world today and be civically active, or at least have civic knowledge so you can make wise decisions and understand what's said as either having validity or not having validity. Whether we agree or disagree, we should be an engaged society in knowing the ramifications of the decisions our government makes and the decisions we make in allowing our government to be made up of what it is. Be well.